any quadratic equation. You can't always factor, you can't always just take a square root, get an x squared by itself, things like that. You might not have a set of parentheses. You can always use the quadratic formula. Okay, now, very first requirement, it has to be set equal to 0. So you'll see down the page here, like I have some of these questions where they have a number on one side or something like that. You have to make sure it's set equal to 0. Then you identify the a, b, and c values. A is your coefficient of your x squared, b is your coefficient of x, and c is your plane number. Does anybody know this lovely formula? I'm going to just write it. It's a giant fraction. Okay, so it's opposite of b or negative b. This is on the top of the fraction. Plus or minus, we've seen that in all our questions that we've been doing with our square roots. And then a giant square root under that b squared minus 4ac, the whole thing over 2a. And I'm going to use my calculator for a lot of this today, but we're going to talk about like an exact answer, and we're also going to talk about an approximate solution just to show the difference between the two. But we're just going to practice using this formula today. So no word problems, no applications, nothing, just practice with this formula today. Okay, now, all you do is you got to make sure to start out the problem that you set the equation equal to 0. And if you're factoring, I was recommending like, hey, we want our x squared term to be positive, or if we're working with completing the square, you need the x squared to just have an x squared. If you're using the quadratic formula, it doesn't matter. You just need to set it equal to 0. So I'm just going to do the least amount of work possible, and that would be to just subtract 4 to the other side, just real quick. And you have to make sure it's set equal to 0 before you identify your a, b, and c values to plug into that quadratic formula. Okay. Now, and if you want to just plug it into the formula, that's fine, but I'm going to go ahead and write these values down. So if you have to identify a, b, and c, what would you tell me that a is for this question? 3, right? All right, what would you tell me b is? -1. And what would you tell me c is? -4. Okay, perfect. Now, notice I don't have an x anywhere in there. You're not ever plugging a variable in. We're plugging these numbers in. And maybe I should pull that back down so we can actually see the formula on the screen there real quick. Okay, so here's how it works. Opposite of b. Well, b is -1. So this would be +1 on the top. Plus or minus square root. B squared would be -1 squared. 4 times your a value, which is 3, times your c value, which is -4. And then don't forget the bottom of the fraction. Sometimes people will start to set this up and they'll forget the bottom of the fraction. The whole thing is over 2a, so this would be over 2 times 3. Okay, now, you can do this however you want. What I usually do is, I'm just going to keep that 1 out in front. I take and type in whatever's under the square root. Now, super important, if your b value is negative, like it was here, make sure if you're typing this into the calculator, you put parentheses around that negative number and you put the squared on the outside so it doesn't give you a negative on accident. Because if you just type -1 squared without parentheses, it'll give you -1, and it should not. So I'm not typing the square root, I'm just typing what I put under the square root. This ends up being 49, and then the bottom of the fraction, 2 times 3 is 6. Okay, what's your square root of 49? 7. That's a perfect square. All right. Now, I have 2 answers. You can't leave it in this format. If you don't see a radical or you don't see an I, the radical's canceled out here because I had a perfect square. If you don't see a radical or you don't see an I, then you can go farther. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say 1 plus 7, divide that by 6. And I'm going to do 1 minus 7, divide that by 6. You don't have to write out a bunch of work. I'm just trying to show you where it comes from. But you can actually add and subtract 7 from that 1 on the top. Now, this guy right here would end up being 8 over 6. This guy right here would be -6 over 6. I'm kind of bleeding into this next question. And if I reduce this fraction, this guy would be 4 over 3. And this guy would be -1. So those are my 2 answers there. But if you end up with a perfect square under the square root, then you're going to be able to go a little bit farther in terms of writing your answer. Is anybody having a question at the moment? Each one of these that we're going to do on the front is a little bit different. Okay, so this next one, first thing you got to do is set it equal to 0. All right, so I'm just going to add 9. And I'm going to write up here because I totally started to go into that next question. All right, so we get x squared plus 6x plus 9 equals 0. Once you set it equal to 0, then we're going to figure out our a, b, and c values. So for this question, what's my a value? If I just have x squared? 1. Good. All right, your b is whatever's in front of x, which is 6. Your c is your plain number, which is 9. All right, don't ever be putting variables in there. Okay, opposite of b, negative 6 plus or minus square root 6 squared 4 times a is 1 times c is 9. Everybody over 2a, so 2 times 1. Oh, and I should have said this. If we have like test or quiz, I'll give you the formula. Okay, you don't have to memorize it. Hopefully you will, but I'm going to do 2 steps here. I'm going to simplify what's under this square root. So I'm not typing the square root, I'm just typing what I wrote underneath it. So I have 6 squared 4 times 1 times 9. And that is 36 minus 36. 6 squared is 36. 4 times 1 is 4 times 9 is also 36. So I'm going to get 0 under the square root here. What is the square root of 0? 0. You can take, like if you do this, like if you do square root of 0, it's just 0. Now, does the plus or minus symbol matter in that particular case? 6 plus 0 is, or negative 6 plus 0 is negative 6 minus 0. So really, if you get a 0 under the square root, this is just going to have one answer. It would just be negative 6 over 2. Plus 0 and minus 0 is not going to do anything to that. This just has one answer. What that means is if we were to graph that, like a y equals x squared plus 6x plus 9, the vertex would be on the x-axis. If you only get one answer, that's what that means. Is anybody having a question? Okay, I'm going to do one more. Now, I'm going to set this equal to 0. So let me add that 212. Okay, now, totally optional, totally optional. I'm just looking at that and noticing that all those numbers are even. You can, if you want to, get rid of the 2, because all of those numbers would be divisible by 2, so you're working with smaller numbers. Or you can plug in those numbers for your a, b, and c values. It's completely up to you. I might recommend, if you can tell, like they're all divisible by something, just so you're working with smaller numbers, but you don't have to do that step. They'd have the same answer. I'm just going to divide everything by 2 really quick to make that a little bit easier to work with. So that'd give me x squared minus 18x, what would that be, plus 106. Just so I don't have to plug in such huge numbers if I don't have to the quadratic formula. Okay, if I get rid of that 2, and you can divide everything by 2 including the 0, then just get rid of it, then my a value would be 1, b value would be negative 18, c value would be 106, and I'm just trying to work with a little bit smaller numbers. You would get the same answer, but it might be a little bit longer to simplify it if we're working on this with the quadratic formula here. All right, so opposite of b is going to end up being positive 18, plus or minus square root negative 18 squared 4 times your a value here ends up being 1 if you get everything divided by 2, and then c ends up being 106. Don't forget the over 2a. Bottom of that fraction is just going to be 2 times 1. Okay, totally up to you, but I like to just simplify just a little step at a time. I'm not typing the square root. I'm just typing what I wrote under the square root into my calculator. Whoa, not 1006. And I got negative 100 when I did that. 2 times 1 is just 2 on the bottom. Okay. What would you write as the square root of negative 100? 10i. Okay, just remember, if you got a negative under the square root, automatically it's going to be an I. But that's a perfect square in imaginary land because it's a perfect square. Well, 100's a perfect square. You just put an I next to it. Okay, now, negative 18 plus or minus 10i over 2. This is not a situation like I had in the first example where I can, like if I move this back a little bit, like I can add or subtract 7. You cannot add or subtract 10i. I don't have a radical, so if you have an I, you're going to just have 2 separate pieces. Now, depends on the question, but if, and it has to be, don't worry about the I though, if all 3 of those numbers are divisible by something, you can divide that. So it has to be every one of those pieces. but each one of those two pieces on the top are divisible by 2. So this is just like reducing a fraction. This would become -9 plus or minus, so -18 divided by 2, there's where I'm getting the -9. 10 divided by 2 is 5, but you have to keep the I next to it, and so just like reducing a fraction. But it has to be all three of those numbers divisible by something. If they're not, then you can just leave it like it is. But in that case, I can divide that. Does anybody have a question? Yes, ma'am. Fired. Okay, you're right. I totally did not. It should have been positive 18. What am I doing? That should be positive 18. I don't know why I wrote that. Yeah, it was supposed to be opposite of B. I had it right up here. No, this should be 18, so then that'll be positive 9. Bad. Okay, glad that you caught that. Does anybody else have any questions? Okay, my apologies. Okay, now, these guys on the back are not going to have nice things under the square root. So on the front, I had a perfect square, real perfect square. We had 0 under square root, and we had a perfect square that was negative. These are not like that. So on the back, it asks you for exact and approximate solutions. Let me flip back to the front. Every single one of these are exact solutions. All right, exact solutions. On the back, I'm going to show you how to get approximate solution. If you're doing an approximate solution, it's going to involve a square root, and it's not going to involve a negative under a square root because we don't approximate that, but we put it in simplest radical form. But if we just have a square, like square root of 5 or whatever, we can do that on the calculator to get what they call an approximate solution. Now, I'm going to do one step here because you do want to set this equal to 0 before you start. And I have a negative x squared just by itself on one side. So I'm going to add that to the other side. That's going to give me 3x squared plus 4x minus 2 equals 0. Okay, now my a value is 3. My b value is 4. And my c value is -2. To plug into the lovely quadratic formula. So I'm going to do opposite of b, which would be -4 plus or minus square root. It's the same thing we did on the front. It's b squared, so 4 squared, minus 4 part of the formula, times the a value, which is 3 here, times the c value, which is -2 here, everybody over 2a, so 2 times 3. All right, now, just like I was doing on the front, I'm not putting the square root, I'm just typing what's under the square root to kind of simplify that a little bit and then see where we need to go from there. So I'm doing 4 squared minus 4 times 3 times -2. I'm literally just typing it into the calculator exactly how I wrote it. And I got 40, which, unlike all the questions that we did on the front, is not a perfect square. Okay, the bottom of this would be 6. So if you want an exact answer, we're going to break down that radical into simplest radical form. So however you want to do that, if you want to do a factor tree, please factor tree away. If it's me, I like to try to find the biggest perfect square that goes into 40. Those perfect squares are up on the board if you want to look at those. But I would just rewrite that real quick as 4 times 10. 4 is the only perfect square that goes into 40. And I can take the square root of 4. So that would pull a 2 out in front. So this is really 2 roots of 10. And I'm going to go back in my question and replace the 40 with that. So this is -4 plus or minus 2 roots of 10, simplest radical form for 40, the whole thing over 6. Now, completely depends on the question. But this is kind of like that problem we just looked at. Don't touch the radical. All right, if all 3 of those numbers, don't even look at the radical. If what's in front of the radical and what's on the other side of the plus and minus and the thing that's in the bottom, if those are all divisible by something, you can reduce that fraction. Don't touch the radical though. This, everybody here is divisible by 2. So this -4 would turn into a -2, plus or minus. Okay, I'm not going to write this. If I divide 2 by 2, what would that be? If I did 2 divided by 2? 1. Okay, so typically you're not going to see a 1 written in front of that. So that's, here, I'll just do it with like a little different color. 2 divided by 2 is 1. It's just not typically written with a 1 in front of something. The bottom of that would be 3. Okay, now this is what we would call our exact answer. Because when you have a square root that's not a perfect square, it's a nasty irrational number that has no pattern, no way to write it as a fraction. So I cannot write that without a radical as an exact answer. So when it says exact answer, it just means simplest radical form. You can do what we call, which is write an approximate answer. All you're going to do is just type this into the calculator. That's it. Okay, now there's going to be two answers here. So let me see if I can get this on the screen at the same time. I'm going to do -2 plus the square root of 10. And then just do me a favor, just hit equals on your calculator and then divide that by 3. So if I do -2 plus root 10 over 3, you don't have to rewrite this, you can just do it on a calculator. But I end up with about, I think it asks, oh, it doesn't say. Let's round to the nearest hundredth. So that's about 0.39. I can also do -2 minus root 10 over 3. So again, just do -2 minus square root of 10, and just for me, just hit equals after you do the numerator, and then divide it by the denominator. So then my other approximate answer is about 1.72. So that plus and minus symbol, when we write the exact answer, I'm taking care of both of those at once with that plus and minus symbol. With the approximate answer, I'm actually doing that on the calculator to get the two different decimal places. So that's what it means by approximate solution. Usually something like that's going to be attached eventually to a word problem, maybe to find a time or a length or something like that. So the exact solution is usually typically for just an equation, but you might need an approximate solution, like I said, for an application problem of some kind. So that's what that is. Okay, let me have you try one more. So again, you got to make sure you set this equal to 0. So I got 2x squared plus 6x plus 7. Then I'm set equal to 0. My a value is 2, b is 6, and c is 7. Alright, so for this guy, we're going to do opposite of b. So I'm going to do -6 plus or minus square root 6 squared minus 4 times 2 times 7. Everybody over 2a, which is 2 times 2 for this question. Okay, I'm going to figure out whatever's under the square root real quick here. Let's scooch that up so we can read it. So I've got 6 squared, 4 times 2 times 7. Alright. I have -6 plus or minus square root -20 over 4. Okay, now, -20 is not a perfect square. Alright, so however you want to do it, I'm going to break that radical down. If you want to do factor tree, just remember to pull an I out in front of it with any negative under a square root. I am going to find the biggest perfect square, which goes into 20, which is actually 4. And then I attach the negative to that. So when I take out the square root of -4, I take the I out when I do that. So this would become 2I radical 5. Alright, so I'm going to go back and replace what I had for that negative square root of 20. This would be 2I radical 5, everybody over 4. Okay, now, when you guys do this, and it doesn't always happen, but I'm trying to practice this with a couple questions with you to see this. Don't touch the radical, alright? Don't touch the radical. If all three of those numbers, and it doesn't matter if it has an I, don't touch the radical. If all three of those are divisible by something, which they're all divisible by 2 here, you can reduce that, but do not change the radical. So this would end up simplifying to be, I'm going to divide everything by 2. -3 plus or minus. Now this would just be I. 2 divided by 2 is kind of like the last question, but we would have an I here in this one. We didn't have an I in the last one because we didn't have a negative under the square root. And then the bottom would be 2. Alright. I'm going to make a little note. You can do simplest radical form. You have no approximate solution if you have an I. You can't type that into, I'm not going to type that into the calculator and get a decimal. Because if you have a scientific calculator, you don't even have an I button anyway. So do not do an approximate solution if you have an I. Doesn't work. Only the exact answer. No approximate solution if you have an I. It's only for real solutions. Is anybody having a question?